Pathways to Prosperity Partnership and the Canadian Immigration Historical Society present Reflections from the Past.
The welcome that we as a country give to refugees who arrive at our borders has always been a barometer of our values. This morning, we're hoping to do a series of interviews that will discuss policy and operational issues and hear the voices of senior officials who have worked over years on these issues inside the department. Their insider perspectives, their stories and their understandings and experiences, we think, are crucial to how we go forward and how we look and value the past and what they have done in working in the world of human migration and its place in the development of Canada and the nation that we have. And we're hoping to pull out of this common themes and issues that will help the debate even today. My name is Martha Nixon. I'm a former senior official who has worked in immigration, and it's my great pleasure to talk today to Mike Molloy, who we worked together in 1979 on the Indo-Chinese movement. And Mike, we're going to talk about your long and interesting and important career in the world of immigration and refugee policy. And I wonder if we could start by going back to when you arrived in 1976 as the Director of Refugee Affairs, and tell me a little bit about your work and how you ended up in that position and what you found when you got there, what was the environment, and how did you first think, what did you think about as you came into that position?
I had joined the Immigration Foreign Service in 1968 and had a number of refugee experiences along the way before I returned to Canada in '76. As a trainee, I happened to arrive for what was supposed to be a few days familiarization in Vienna just after the Russians marched into Czechoslovakia. So I spent 6 weeks as a very, very junior and untrained person doing what I could to help the team that was dealing with those 11,000 Czechs that came to Canada. I had subsequently a posting to Japan, and then was shifted to Beirut and had the great opportunity of being part of the Canadian team that moved 6,000 Ugandans to Canada and in 1972. And subsequently worked for 4 years in Minneapolis. And to my great surprise, at the end of that, I knew it was time to go back to Canada, but I was told I was going to head up a new division called Refugee Affairs. Now my expectation at the time, based on ruminations of what I'd seen in those other refugee operations, was that we needed a better framework for managing our resettlement operations. I didn't have too much in my mind beyond that. And I arrived in Canada in the summer of '76, shortly after the Immigration Act of 1976, which for the first time embedded refugees in Canadian legislation. And the task was, at that stage, to take the elements that were basically just simply signaled in the Act and turn them into something that would actually make a difference in the world and in the way we operated. We had signed the United Nations Refugee Convention a few years before, in 1969, which
Can I just stop you
Yeah.
there and maybe you could just talk about what that meant, because that was a pretty significant thing to do. So can you just explain what the significance of that
Okay.
was briefly?
Okay. Following the Second World War, Canada, the Canadian Immigration Department was fairly jealous of anything that would impinge in any way on our ability to determine who would be allowed to arrive on or stay on our territory. Over the next 20 years, there came a realization that people were going to be arriving spontaneously anyways. The transportation revolution made it inevitable. The arrival of air transport, so people could get to Canada quickly and easily, as opposed to what had gone in all the years before, where people either came across the U.S. border or arrived by ship, and it was very manageable. And I think there was a realization in the government that we needed a tool to deal with people who were arriving spontaneously if they claimed that they were running away from persecution or the likes. And the Refugee Convention, which had first appeared in 1951, and which at that time was focused exclusively on Europe, had been modified in 1967 with a protocol that made it universal in its application. It no longer just applied to essentially to post-World War I or post-World War II Europe. It became universal. And so, and it provided a definition and it provided a set of rules, or perhaps standards is a better way to describe it, that made sure that when a person arrived on our territory, he or she was not arbitrarily sent back to some place where they feared persecution. So that was the essence of it.
Yeah.
And so that meant that by the time I got back, we had a fair amount of experience in using the refugee definition as a selection tool. Not always good experience, because it's a great protection tool, not necessarily a good selection tool. And in addition, we had, as a result of signing on, we had to create a small committee to look at the cases of people who did show up spontaneously in Canada and who said, "Hey, I'm a refugee." And so there was a small committee that actually was under my supervision. I discovered when I returned, that was looking at transcripts from interviews done across Canada relating to people who claimed to be refugees.
And the implications of the Geneva Convention in the new Act, in the 76 Act, that was fairly important, fairly central piece.
We had the refugee definition, which is a person with a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, social group, etc., was embedded in that legislation, and as well as the procedures for a more elaborate refugee status determination system, and in addition, convention refugees were named in that act as one of the standing categories of people who could be selected abroad for resettlement in Canada. Now, that's about as far as the act went in terms of the overseas part of the refugee activity, where we sent teams out and bring people to Canada. But it was clear that there was going to have to be a refugee convention class of immigrants designed. It was signaled there, but there was very little. There was no meat on the bones, and so part of the task of the division was to figure out, okay, so what will be the rules for convention refugees that we encounter in refugee camps anywhere in the world.
So as you were looking at, basically part of your responsibility was to implement this new act and to look at ways to make it real for the people who had to do the selection,
Right.
and who had to make decisions. So how did you go about doing that? What were the challenges? What was the environment in which you were doing all this work?
The fact that I'd actually worked on a very important refugee movement really was a big help, because I could visualize what needed to happen when a refugee showed up at an embassy or an immigration officer from Canada went to a refugee camp. The first task, and essentially there were 3 or 4 things that had to be done. First of all, we had to define how the convention refugee category of people would be selected through our embassies abroad. Second, the Act brought in signaled the provision of what were called designated classes. There were times when the convention definition wasn't appropriate. For example, when we were in Uganda, people were certainly facing persecution, but they technically weren't refugees because they were still in their own country.
Right.
And at the time that I arrived back, we were taking people out of Chile who were not refugees. They were certainly oppressed, but they hadn't fled, and we were taking them. So it was clear we needed a definition that would allow us to operate inside of other countries. And there were two other circumstances that needed designated classes at the time. The third package was the Act signaled for the first time that there would be a formal legal provision for the sponsorship of refugees. Okay, so with the convention refugee, with the convention refugee part, that was the first task because that was going to be the cornerstone class.
Yeah.
Okay, and we, in analyzing what needed to happen, we decided that there were two steps in the process. There was the question of, was the person eligible to be considered as a convention refugee? And then second, was that person admissible to Canada? So eligibility is, in other words, is this person a person defined as having a well-founded fear of persecution for the following reasons? So we had to define how a visa officer or an official would interview a person and could come to that conclusion. The second part, where we had where the Canadian NGOs had a great deal of influence on what we did. Up until that point, the point system applied very formally to refugees, although the point system had built into it, and Cabinet made it very clear that we were to take this into account. There was an override provision called where officers could exercise their discretionary authority and set aside the point system. Well, what we decided to do was that we would keep the factors that are signaled in the point system: age, education, occupation, skill level. Do you have families? How's your language? Do you speak a Canadian language? Those sorts of things. But we would take the points out, and that the refugee would be selected against much softer criteria. The Act was very clear that refugees coming to Canada, like everybody else, had to have a reasonable prospect for a successful establishment.
Right.
But we took a much softer and much more long-term approach to that, and taking into account the fact that there was much more assistance from the government, and there would be this sponsorship provision coming down. So the first thing was to work that out, and once we got that done, we then had a template that we could, from there, move on to the designated classes. Of those, there were three circumstances that we needed to account for. The first had to do with those issues or those circumstances where the person or a group of people were still in their own country and had not, for various reasons, been able to flee. But the government of Canada, the Cabinet, had decided we're going to intervene on their behalf. And so initially, we were operating at that stage in both Chile and Argentina, where we were taking people as a result of what was called the Dirty Wars in the southern cone of South America. So we basically said, we took the convention definition and applied it to them, but taking out the part of the definition that said outside their country of nationality. So the idea is we had this sort of modified convention definition to apply to them. And then the cabinet would list countries in a little schedule. We didn't want visa officers wandering around anywhere in the world, going into countries and taking people out holus bolus. If you're going to do that, you really do need the authority of your government because you're implying to the government of the country that you're working in that you're mistreating your citizens. So you don't want people freelancing on that. So we had a convention definition minus the outside the country part of that definition, and then a list of countries that could apply to. And eventually it became known as the political prisoners and oppressed persons category. That's the first one. Second, had to do with the circumstances we were facing in Europe. The Cold War was still on. We were part of NATO. We had troops over there that were sort of our hostages that would bring us into a war if something broke out between between Russia and the Europeans and the Americans. We had a big part of the Canadian population were Eastern Europeans or of Eastern European origin. They quite naturally were very concerned about their co-citizens who were in increasing numbers getting out one way or another of the Soviet Union, often because they were privileged, often because they were trusted. And once in Western Europe, were going right away to the UN and saying, hey, I don't want to go back. Now, these people often had a hard time complying under the convention definition because far from being persecuted in their country of origin, they were actually privileged people. They were trusted people who were allowed to travel abroad. But once they took the big step of saying, we're not going back, they then put themselves in a very bad situation vis-a-vis the authorities of those Eastern European countries, including the Soviet Union. And we actually we went to the man who was running our office in Rome and said, if you had a definition, if you could make up a definition that would work for you better than the convention definition, what would it be? And in fact, the original template for the designated classes came out of that. And so what came out of that was something called the self-exiled class, which was much less rigorous than the convention definition, but recognized the fact that once these people declared they wanted to avoid going home, they would be in real trouble if they were sent home, and recognized as well that there was tremendous support in Canada for bringing these people in. So that was the self-exile designated class. The third one that we needed, and needed desperately, was that by the time we got working on the designated classes in 1977, it was clear that we were going to be facing a huge problem in Southeast Asia. Saigon had fallen in 75. We'd taken about 7,000 people. It died down, and then the boat people phenomenon appeared. And our officers out there were required to use the convention definition. So you can imagine a boat arrives, and the Canadian officer is sitting there and saying, well, as these people get off, well, do you have a well-founded fear of persecution? At a time when countries in that region that these refugees were arriving at were pushing boats back out, and the camps were full, and the asylum countries were deeply concerned about the numbers building up. So we thought, okay, we need to cut through. If we were going to save these people who were dying in large numbers because they were sinking at sea, they were being pushed out, they were dying of thirst, they were being attacked by pirates. If we're going to save them, we need a definition that fits them. So again, we crafted a definition that said, if you are from Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia, and you've left after this stage, we essentially consider you as a refugee. And that greatly simplified the very complicated work of going into these camps. So so that's the selection part.
It's fascinating because it seems like there was an intersection at that time of sort of the political will, the sort of thinking process in the department, and probably even community support for what you were doing, because you brought in things that were responding immediately to needs, and you brought with a sponsorship possibility a lot of community support. Was that the environment in which you launched all these things?
Well, it was support, but it was often support that was delivered in pretty strident terms to us. When the coup happened in Chile in 1973, the government was kind of caught wrong-footed, and the churches in particular that were concerned with problems in Central America and South America, rather, and turned out there were a lot, who knew, weren't very happy with the way that the refugee system, our refugee system was working there. And in fact, our posture was a posture of defending ourselves from infiltration from the east, and from the left, from the communist regimes and that sort of thing. So all the machinery was set up to deal with that. Well, the people coming at us were running away from right-wing regimes, and so it took a while to get everything recalibrated. And in the process, I think the unhappiness among the Canadian advocacy groups resulted in the creation of very potent and forceful lobby, who, truth be told, pushed us where we wanted to go. But that was really important, particularly in our operations in South and Central America, was that there was a group that were really anxious for us to do things, were well organized and capable of bringing political pressure to bear in the right places. There was this huge group of people, in particular in Western Canada and Southern Ontario, whose roots were in Eastern Europe, and they were continually coming to the Immigration Department and the government in general, saying, we want more. And then there was this growing sense, and when we were working on this, the support group for that was just beginning to crystallize. But there were people like the Mennonites and the Christian Reformed, who were Reformed Church of Canada, who were watching what was going on in Southeast Asia, who had, in the case of the Mennonites, had people out there doing all sorts of relief work, and who were coming to us and saying, we really need something to do. Now, one of the things that had been, there had been various forms of refugee sponsorship that had been applied at various times, but there wasn't a program. It wasn't something that was rooted in law, where people had certain clearly where the sponsors needed to do things and the government would do things, and it just seemed to us at the time when we were working on this that if we could capture that concern, it would do two things. It would allow us to take bigger numbers, and it would allow us to take more difficult cases. There was a lot of pressure saying, Canada's always, over and over, you hear the accusation, well, you creamed off the best of this group or that group or the other group. And I suppose sometimes we did, and sometimes just because we treated people better in these operations, qualified people came to us, people who were adaptable came to us. So it's a kind of a mix. And as a civil servant, I never had any great difficulty in wanting to get people to come to the country who would do well. But I think there was a sense that if we could create a sponsorship system that would allow people, rather than just worrying about a situation, actually participate in resolving a situation by taking responsibility for a refugee family. That, as I say, it would do two things. We knew it would mean that we could add these on to the government quota over and above. But we also knew that if at that stage refugees were largely being resettled by Canada Employment Centres, with a little bit of help from various NGOs. And we thought, well, if you can actually get Canadian churches or community groups or even groups of neighbors to take a family in, then it'll increase the numbers, and perhaps we can be more generous in who we let in, because we know they'll get a better reception. So the actually designing that was really much more complicated than we thought it would be. The simple part was deciding what would government do for those people and what would the sponsors do. There were forces within the department that wanted to dump everything on the churches. You wanted it, you get it. But there were others, and I think a colleague of ours by the name of Gordon Barnett played a pivotal role in this, who came to see in negotiations with various Canadian groups that the sponsors would be ideally situated to do certain things, but the government's network would be ideally situated to do other things. So in other words, it would be silly to say to sponsors, "Oh, you have to do language training." We had a network of through the Canada Employment Centres in the country. We had all sorts of abilities to create courses and to go to institutions and have language training or skills upgrading done. I mean, why would you say to a group of people sponsoring them, "Well, you have to take this person and put them in a vocational"? So we had those, but receiving the person, finding the place for them to live, making sure they had clothing and food for the first little while, helping them figure out how to take the bus and put the kids in school and get hooked up with the medical plan. Those are things that ordinary people could do. So that was the package. It was the immediate care, and we thought, okay, a year or until the person is on their feet should be the time. If it's beyond that, the welfare system should pick the person up if they're not established. So the time would be a year. It would be sort of the immediate needs of life and reception and establishment that they would do. But language training and other things we would do. Because we had we were part of the Canadian Employment and Immigration Convention. We had huge networks across the country. But the complex part was, where does the story begin? Does it begin with a group in Canada hearing about a particular individual abroad, or does it begin with a visa officer encountering somebody abroad and designing it? It was like the wiring. It looked like a wiring diagram for a very complicated computer by the time we got it done, and that was the complex thing. And we had no idea of the numbers. And we sort of thought, well, maybe 400 or 500 families a year. So when you're thinking about that, you can build all sorts of safeguards. And we had this model of people sitting safely in refugee camps in Europe,
Yes.
and so we were designing that. Well, guess what happened? Before the ink wasn't dry on our first set of mocked up forms, when the avalanche of Indochina hit us, and instead of talking about 400 or 500 people being sponsored in a year, we were talking. Well, we discovered 7,000 sponsorship groups being formed almost before our eyes,
Huge,
looking for
huge enthusiasm.
and sponsoring 40 or 50,000 people.
Yeah.
It's kind of as if our little sponsorship car came off the assembly line, and we had to put it right back in and put bigger everything in it, bigger pipelines, and we had to find simpler ways of ensuring that we weren't drowning in red tape. And the breakthrough in that came with the decision to negotiate with large organizations like churches a kind of master agreement where they would agree to back up their local congregations or parishes, and that would save the local or congregation or parish the business of going to the local immigration office and proving rigorously that they had everything in place. They would get a letter from the bishop or the head of the church saying, this parish, church, or whatever is authorized to sponsor in our name. We're backing it up. So once we got those in place, that cut out a massive amount of paperwork. At the same time, the other thing we built into it was the notion that, not everybody belongs to a church or some faith group. And so we thought, well, why shouldn't, suppose just ordinary a group of neighbors or a group of relatives decide they want to participate. And so we made provision for what we called the group of 5. And we thought if you have a group of 5, typically that means you've actually got a group of 10, because it's probably 5 families. So there's 2 members, adults in each family. So then we got 10 right away, and it may be bigger than 5. And particularly during the Indochinese program, we had lots and lots of those groups forming spontaneously, lots through the churches and parishes. But that turned out to be a really good conduit through which just groups of concerned citizens could come together and bring in a refugee. So that but in those cases, there were rules. They had to go and to an immigration office and show that they had a plan, that they had money in the bank, they had resources, they knew what they were doing. So all that was going on. It wasn't as if the rest of the world stopped when we were doing that.
This was very concentrated activity and took off in unprecedented ways.
Yeah.
But there was a whole world scene unfolding,
Pushing us like crazy.
Yes, and so tell me a bit about what was happening abroad. What were other countries doing? What was the reaction to all of this?
Okay, this was a time internationally when we weren't the only ones in the world that had realized that refugees were going to be part of what was going to have to be done on an ongoing basis. If you looked at the previous decades after the Second World War, there was a big refugee event once a decade. The Hungarians, the Czechs. All of a sudden, as we moved as our immigration opened up to the world with the point system and the removal of the racial barriers that had been part of the system since Confederation, there was a realization in the government and in the country and certainly in the department that refugees were going to be a full-time business line. But this was happening elsewhere. This was happening in Scandinavia. This was happening in Australia. In the United States, people were having to redesign and recalibrate and rethink what to do about refugees. And I like to think, and I think anybody who looks at it, we were in the lead on that. We were out a little bit ahead of many other people. The legislation we brought in provided a great framework. And the other thing that was really very useful was that we were able to go, for example, to the UN High Commission meetings in Geneva and bounce ideas off of the Aussies or the Swedes or others, and that allowed us to enrich our own thinking, and it was good for us to know that we were kind of a step ahead of everybody else. That was an additional motivation to do it and to do it right.
Explain a little bit how our connection with the international situation works. I mean, you would be in the middle of all of this, running off to meetings in Geneva. You would be connecting with the United Nations. You would be seriously discussing with other countries in Europe, but also in the United States, I would imagine.
Right.
So, as a Refugee Affairs Director, what were your connections and how did you make sure that we were sharing ideas and that we were working closely with other countries, because we don't work alone. Everything we do affects other countries.
Okay, we had, Canada decided to accept, first of all, that there would be a representative of the High Commission for Refugees in Ottawa. And so we had somebody right there, who actually participated in the work of the little refugee board that was looking at people who were arriving spontaneously, and it was there as an observer and as an advisor. So he was in the building once a week, every week, and so when we were encountering things, it was always good to know that he would drop in after his meetings of the board, and we could talk about whatever we were working on. So that was the first level. The second level was the more formal part, where once a year the UN High Commission for Refugees would have its executive committee meeting in Geneva, and I discovered to my great pleasure that was mine. That was the thing that I would do. And so you truck off there in October, and you would participate not only in the general discussions there, but there was always a section on resettlement, and where you were expected to get up and make a speech about what we were doing and what we were thinking. And also there was something called there was a committee on protection, which was where the whole business of how the asylum systems in the world, how you deal with the spontaneous arrivals, were being discussed, and where standards beyond what is in the convention were being carefully analyzed, discussed. Governments were in kind of a liberal mood at that stage, and so there was a sense that in Europe there was an effort to go beyond the convention. The EU, as we know it today, wasn't there, but the European communities, there were various institutions where Europeans were coming together and talking about refugee issues, and that was then coming back to us through the High Commission for Refugees. There was also an attempt by the High Commissioner at the time to supplement the Refugee Convention with what was called the Territorial Asylum Convention. The Refugee Convention says, look, when somebody arrives at your border, you're not allowed to push them back to where they fear persecution. Amen. But it doesn't say anything about what happens next. And so there was a huge conference in January '77 in Geneva that was trying to take the next step. Well, it was a miserable failure. We came there. We were all set to go because we were designing our new asylum system. We thought we could fit within any parameters that existed at the time. We came with a very positive attitude, but it did not please the Soviet bloc, and it did not please many of the countries of the Third World that there was going to be a new convention that would impose more obligations. But that whole exercise of even having to participate in a conference like that and look at the standards that were emerging as they were preparing for this conference, and looking at what we were designing and making sure that we were situated comfortably in those, that we would be perhaps slightly more liberal than what they were doing, provided a useful frame of reference. There was the other thing that was a big part of it, of that international activity, was our relationship with the resettlement unit of the UN High Commission for Refugees. And it was run by an astonishing Greek lady by the name of Harry Brasimi, who was utterly charming, and who would, was continually on the phone with us from Geneva. If you'll only deal with this, take this case, it will solve the problem. And I used to always say to her, Harry, if we take this case, it will transfer the problem, but we'll think about it. But there was, the UNHCR tended to come to us, not at that stage, just before Indochina broke, not necessarily about huge problems, but rather a group of people who showed up in Greece or showed up in Belgium who were anomalous, and they couldn't stay where they were, and it was quite common, once every 6 weeks or so, either Mrs. Brasimi or more often the Deputy High Commissioner, very respected American by the name of Charles Mace, would call up my bosses and say, we got a little problem here. We think maybe you Canadians are the solution.
And often they were hard to settle.
They were hard to settle people, and people that were causing the local authorities of whatever country that they pitched up in some grief. And so we were forever, responding to these little kind of groups of 20 or 30 or 40 people that were stranded here or there. We had a tremendously active relationship with the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, because there were a lot of Soviet and Eastern European Jews beginning to pitch up in Western Europe, and the great pleasure working with them is that they had a really good settlement system themselves, and when they said they'd look after somebody, you could take that to the bank. It was really good. So they were extremely professional, and really a pleasure to work with, because they knew their business. They knew how to package the cases in ways that we could deal with them. The other thing that was very useful for us was to periodically go down to Washington and see what they were thinking. And as the Indochina refugee situation began to emerge from sort of as you got into late '77, beginning of '78, and the numbers began to build, it was actually more common for them to come to us. But 4 or 5 times a year we get this delegation of very important Americans arriving to try and nudge us in the direction of doing a little more than we were. The good thing was that we were creating the tools that allowed us to respond. The relationship with other countries tended to be cordial. They tended to look at us as people who were at the leading edge in innovating, both in terms of our asylum systems and in terms of our resettlement systems. And that was kind of a very happy situation to be in, where we were not necessarily just responding, but actually influencing them, because our thinking was a bit ahead of theirs, and our systems were ahead of theirs, and we were continually being asked to look at things. And I remember several times people coming from Scandinavia and wanting to understand what it was we were doing, because they were thinking of overhauling their own system. So that was kind of a nice part of it.
Well, was it evident at that time that the asylum system was the greater focal point for those countries, or were they more interested in resettlement? Because the asylum system gradually, as we got through things like the big Indo-Chinese movement, and you started to realize that there were a lot more people who were showing up at our borders, and you were starting to see, I suspect, that sort of tension between, can we say yes, how do we say no, what really it was happening with our asylum system, and was it mirrored in the kind of concern or issues that you were talking about at the multilateral level?
Yeah. Okay. Well, when I arrived back in Canada, as I said, the '76 Act had just come into effect, and we had 2 years to implement it. And the asylum part of it, unlike the resettlement part, was actually spelled out in the processes were spelled out in great detail in the Act. And so we knew what the process would look like, because much of that was embedded in the law. And there was a great deal of controversy around it. the groups that had, the coalition of interest in Canada that had formed around the Chilean, Argentinian refugee situation began to take a huge interest in our asylum processes, because in addition to the Chileans and Argentinians and others that we were bringing to Canada through formal resettlement processes, they were beginning to pitch up at the frontier, arriving on airplanes saying, here we are, we're refugees. And it was the first time we'd actually had to deal with a situation where we were both resettling and receiving asylum seekers from the same source. So the churches, a growing number of lawyers, human rights advocates, began to focus on what we were planning to do under the Act. And they were particularly happy with with what became the Refugee Status Advisory Committee. Now, it was the Refugee Status Advisory Committee was a huge leap from where we had been with this tiny little committee that worked for me.
It was pretty invisible.
Well, pretty invisible, and the great liberality of the thing was that somebody from External Affairs sat on it. So this brought their great expertise on what was going on in the world to bear, and the UNHCR was there as an observer. Well, under the Refugee Status Advisory Committee, we actually we set up a more or less arm's length from the Immigration Department institution that had its own infrastructure. What dissatisfied the churches and others was that we were still working from transcripts. The refugee would apply at the airport or would pitch up at an immigration office somewhere in Canada with the lawyer. There would be there would be an interview, and then they would examine the transcripts and make the decisions on the basis of that. Right from the very start, that coalition of people concerned about it were demanding that there be face-to-face hearings between the decision makers and the refugee, and there was a lot of pressure for that to be done. Now, and the interesting thing is, I mean, there's nothing in the convention that tells you what the convention says is don't push them back. How you come to that decision is your own business. But during my time, I remember costing out what it would look like if we actually had, if we had panels situated across the country. And I remember came out to what at that stage was a shocking figure of $35 million a year. And when I showed it to my superiors, they just laughed and said, "Dream on. Nobody's going to spend that kind of money on asylum." Ha ha. Well, little did we know. But what was so that we were getting that pressure on the domestic front, and at the same time, the work being done in Geneva, particularly at the Subcommittee on Protection of the High Commissioner's Executive Committee, was working painfully and diligently to flesh out standards that would not necessarily that would take what was required in the convention and give guidance into greater depth of processes. We participated very, very seriously in that. I recall there were long and quite dreadful meetings, but nevertheless, what came out of them was singularly useful to us, because that we could bring that home to Canada and say, well, that's the international standard right now, and here's what we're doing. We better adjust this little thing to make sure that we're safely within this particular recommendation. And it was not as if this was soft law. This was soft international law. It was guidelines rather than something that was binding. But at that stage, we found that it was really useful to, one, participate in the process, and two, then be able to come home and look at what we were doing and making sure that, yes, we are exactly where we should be. We are the cutting edge of the development of these processes. But I don't think anybody at that stage had any idea of where the asylum thing would go in the next 5 or 10 years.
The numbers were still relatively small.
Oh, I remember. When I acquired the precursor committee, there was a shocking backlog of 300 cases. And and we're told, got to eliminate those. And by the time I left, there was, we had been so successful that there was a backlog of about 1,200. And that was just the way things were happening in the world. You had to, it didn't matter how much resource you put into it, the asylum seeker phenomena of people arriving either from Eastern Europe or from the Third World to industrial countries like Canada was becoming a major phenomenon. And I don't think we had any idea how big it was going to get or how it was going to expand. But it's not as, but at the same time, we paid a lot of attention to it because once we signed the convention, we had obligations. We had legal obligations. In the resettlement game, we had commitments and we had things that we wanted to do, to reach out, to play our role. But when you were dealing with people arriving on our territory, then you have convention obligations. So you had to get that right. And in the subsequent years, we've seen how getting that right has been such a big challenge.
Mike, if you look at the 2 years that you were directing and doing all these incredible things, really, it was a very intense time. It was one where you established a really essentially important framework or kind of base for the evolution of refugee policy as it's evolved over the years. Looking at that period in your life and trying to link it now to really where you've seen things go. Can you just talk a little bit about, I'd really like to hear you talk about how we actually take a piece of legislation and we work on its implementation, because it strikes me that so many times we benefited immigration from having people who had been out in the field, who had actually worked in a refugee area, who had experience in the field, and came in and then worked through policy issues. So there was this ability to take experience and put it into policy. And working that through and looking at what you accomplish and where it's gone in the future. Just talk a little bit about, the operations side of it and how it all worked together, and B, looking back and looking forward. What is the significance of the period in which you worked in refugee affairs?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I was lucky to be doing this in an era where, first of all, we had a green space to work in. There was nothing, very little there. That was the first thing. The second thing that you point to, which was a great strength of the immigration program at the time, is that we were 20 years into having essentially a professional foreign service, where there was a body of men and women who were selected to do immigration work abroad, who were selected against the standards of the Canadian Foreign Service, which are very demanding standards. So we had really a lot of really capable people. And those capable people would typically spend more than half of their career abroad. But when they came back, they were expected to be able to do policy, operations, program design, operational management, things of that nature. And you knew that when you were designing these things, that you might find yourself 3 years down the road in an embassy abroad having to implement them.
Exactly. So
in my case, that intensive experience in Uganda really made an enormous difference. And I've got to give one a really interesting example. We had just got the sponsorship system more or less mapped out, and somebody from World University Services of Canada showed up in my office one day and said, what are you guys doing for refugee students? Well, to tell you the truth, we hadn't thought much about them, but by gosh, we had taken large numbers of refugee students from Hungary, which was long before my time. But in Kampala, in Uganda, we actually were presented by a Canadian professor at one of the universities one day with 29 or 30 medical students who got their expulsion notices. And we were able to, he was able to very quickly talk to somebody in Canada, and we ended up with a telegram from Canada saying, you let those guys in, we'll place them in Canadian schools. So when the fellow from the World University Services walked into my office, I think he came expecting a fight. I said, boy, have I got a deal for you. And the WUSC refugee program came right out of that.
Wonderful program.
Yeah, it's been going on for decades now, and more than 1,000 students have come to Canada through it. I think so that was great strength that we, and it was not, I mean, goodness gracious, I was, compared to many of my colleagues, I was far from the leading edge in terms of thinking and that sort of stuff. But our ability to combine operational experience and knowing how the wheels, to make the wheels turn. When you came to designing, taking a policy that the government had, in this case, put in law, and then say, oh, so, there's one line, if you think about the designated class, there's one line in the 76 Act that says, and the Governor General can designate people for admission in line with our humanitarian traditions. That was the guidance we got. Well, you then had to so the first step was to say, well, first of all, think about, so what do we want to do, and sort of work out the policy implications of that. Then you had to figure out, so what would it look like in a regulation, and then what does that regulation have to look like? What are the elements you're going to add on to that, so that when these people arrive, they get all the benefits. And then the next step was, okay, so you've got your regulation, but then you have to think about the officer setting off in Kuala Lumpur and setting up the operation. You then had the next step is we had to design manuals which said, okay, here's the process, guys. When you're trying to determine whether somebody's a convention refugee, here's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 pages of guidance on what you do. So you work all that out. You show that to the NGOs. You show that to the UNHCR. You make sure it's okay. And then so having done that, then what are you going to do about how are you going to determine if this person is capable of establishing in Canada? So you write another 4 or 5 pages. You look at this, you look at that. You think, remember that we've got all these things going in Canada. Cabinet has always told us, they want us to be generous, blah blah blah. And then, okay, if the person's going to be sponsored, well, how is that going to happen? So there was a full year's work to take those little lines in the Act, build the regulations that took it to the next step, build then the instructions and the instructions of the process in the visa office abroad. This is what you do: step 1, step 2, step 3, and then of course there's the tools, there's the forms. This may sound very bureaucratic, but if you don't capture the data some way on paper or later in a computer program, you can't act on it. So that was a pretty intensive year working on that, and we were a really small team. There was Mike Molloy and there was Carla Thorlickson. Amen. That's the team. Now we worked with the settlement people on things. We worked with the legal people on things. We worked with the operational branches on things. But at the end of the day, it was 2 people working very closely with our Director General, and we rolled out all this stuff. And the great thing was that we got it all rolled out and into a China hit. And when the Mennonites, and when the Christian Reformed, and when the others came to the door saying, what can we do? Operation Lifeline, what can we do? We said, here, if we got a deal for you. If you really, you can talk and you can raise money, but if you'd actually like to increase the numbers, here's how the sponsorship system worked. So it was really, just in time policy development, and we were so lucky. But we had
political support at that point too. That helped a lot.
Oh yes, and we were working under first of all Robert Andrus, who was one of the really great immigration ministers of all time, and then Bud Cullen, who really had a tremendous passion for our refugee mission, and who just wanted us to have good systems to do with it. So that made a huge, and then a bit later Lloyd Axworthy, also very, very committed to our refugee role. That made a huge difference. And then, the pressure we were getting from the Canadian public, or from the interest groups, was always something you had to manage. It was not, the interchanges were not always as pleasant as you'd like them to be. But as I said before, for the most part, they were pushing us where we wanted to go. And so that was just, that was just more wind in our sails. And when and the sense that we were at that stage ahead of everybody else in the world in terms of thinking these things through, gave us just an added little bit of motivation to do it well. But and the other thing is, while all this is going on, the problems in Chile, the problems in Europe, the problems in Indochina didn't disappear, and in many instances, the advocacy groups that felt the best way to influence was we get 500 or 600 people to write us individual letters. And the rules were you had to answer all those letters.
Indeed.
So in the middle of all this, we're sitting down grinding out sometimes 30, 40 letters a day, in addition to doing the operational. I mean, there were units in immigration headquarters that say we're dealing with South America. But when a refugee problem came up, they came to us for operational advice. And so in addition to that, we were continually having to make adjustments and tinker and reinterpret the rules for these things as new situations arose. So it was really quite a...
Well, it's amazing to think about you doing all of that without computers.
No computers.
Dealing
We
with
got
electric computers.
We got a wonderful automatic typewriter that showed 20 letters in a row, and you could sit with the secretary. Once the thing had been dictated and typed, we'd sit and read the words as they went past. So no computers, no internet, nothing like that. It was all being done in an analog.
Mike, we have only a few minutes left, but I want you to just reflect back and think about Tell me the best story, or if you think about that part of your career, what do you remember the most? What story leaps out at you, or what kind of wisdom comes to you when that was a pretty intense period of your career? You went on to do lots more interesting things, but what do you recall most about that? What did that experience bring to you?
The first thing it did, and it was a lesson that was administered both, in both hard and soft ways, was that there were people in Canada that really cared passionately about our business, and you could, and you had to be constantly aware of that. That we were there. It's the Canadian people, and I mean, to me, the great fun was of doing the sponsorship system was actually empowering people to do that. So that was the one thing that when I look back on that, was one of the outstanding things, the way that was designed. I think the other thing that was really important at that stage was that in the configuration we were in the department with the employment and manpower people, was that we had all the tools in the hands of one minister. That minister had, owned the immigration offices and the embassies abroad, the ports of entry, and the whole settlement system, including the manpower centers across the country. And so you had that, and that was one of the things I've always been very, very, very concerned when people start deciding where they're going to put the immigration program, because given particularly what happened with the Indochina thing, where as you know, Martha, we brought in 60,000 people in 2 years. We couldn't have done it with any other configuration we had. We had all the tools together, and I think governments have to think very carefully about that. That if you have, once you have breaks between departments dealing with the same institution and reporting to different ministers who will necessarily have different priorities, you end up with more difficulties than you really need. And so that was the other thing, that in the subsequent years, as the immigration department went from one setup to another, I was always very concerned about whether we were going to end up in a situation where essential components for delivering, particularly the refugee part, would be alienated from the department because they were sitting somewhere else. And that's something that, you know, we went through. In fact, we subsequently went through a period where the Immigration Foreign Service was with the Department of Foreign Affairs, and that was, you know, there were many good things about that. But in terms of the having a seamless ability to deal with the refugee situation or any immigration situation for that matter, that was not good for the program. Might have been good for the officers, but it was not good for the program because you were forever negotiating across departmental boundaries as to how things would be delivered. So you need to think of the immigration program as a system. And that was one of the things that I carried away from that, was that you wanted to have all the tools under the command of one minister and one executive team if you were going to be do it effectively, and if you were going to do it you're going to be cost effective as well.
Mike, I think we're going to leave it there. It's been totally fascinating talking with you, listening to you. I marvel at your ability to remember and to pull all of this together really cogently and make it interesting, even to someone like me who's been around for a long time. I thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and sharing your ideas and telling us about your time as Refugee Affairs Director. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Martha. Always nice to have a chance to talk.